Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a topic that might make you feel a little uncomfortable. But it's also fascinating what sex was really like in medieval times. Picture yourself in a small, dimly lit stone room. It's drafty, cold, and there's the faint scent of sweat and unwashed bodies. You're getting ready for a marriage that's likely been arranged long before you had any say in the matter. And, spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to post your location and local time in the comment scene. Always curious where my audience is tuning in from now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Asterisk, in medieval times, the idea of a perfect marriage didn't really exist. Forget about romantic strolls under the moonlight or sweet nothings whispered in the dark. Instead, your marriage was likely about survival and social duty. Your family made the decision for you whether you were young or old, and it had little to do with love. It was a business transaction. The primary aim is to secure alliances, inherit land, and produce heirs. You weren't choosing someone who looked good across a candlelit table. No, you were probably just meeting your future spouse. For the first time on your wedding day, medieval marriages were set up with a contract literally. The families negotiated dowries, land, and inheritance rights. Your life could be summed up by a few key things: your ability to provide children, especially sons, and your contribution to the family name. Love. Well, it wasn't exactly on the menu. In fact, that wasn't even a consideration in the arrangement. The notion that marriage was based on romantic affection would have been a bit laughable back then. And that's where the sex part gets real. Because once you walked down the aisle, that was the moment when the grim reality set in. It wasn't about passion. It was about fulfilling a duty. The wedding night itself was typically seen as a formality to kickstart this business arrangement. You could expect to be expected to perform, regardless of how you were feeling or who your spouse even was. This wasn't a scene from a romantic comedy. It was an obligation, a hard, often awkward one. Historians still argue whether people back then had any concept of love when it came to marriage, or if it was solely about the logistics. The lack of courtship meant that the first time you really saw your spouse in any meaningful way was in that intimate, somewhat terrifying moment. Some sources even suggest that medieval wedding nights were full of anxiety, not just for the bride, but for the groom as well. After all, this was a partnership thrust upon you by your families, with little room for escape. It was a time when marriage wasn't about creating emotional bonds, but about survival. And as much as you probably don't want to hear it, your first night of married life wouldn't exactly be a walk in the park. You'd be lucky if you even had a bed. Many couples slept on straw mattresses. Sharing it with whatever animals might have also been brought in to keep warm. The thought of any romantic atmosphere was laughable, and that's just the beginning. Medieval marriage came with some incredibly bizarre and sometimes downright gross rituals. So, let's not sugarcoat it. You're already way out of your comfort zone, and it's only going to get worse from here. Hey, let's push forward. Just make sure you have a strong stomach. Now that you've gotten the reality check, let's take a deeper dive into what life was like in the medieval marriage game, where the stakes were much higher than you might expect. The process of getting married wasn't just about a simple I do. In fact, it was a full-blown business arrangement that could determine your future or lack thereof. If you thought the wedding night was tough, wait until you see what happens before you even get there. You see, medieval marriages were arranged with military precision, and you were just a pawn in a much bigger game. There were no dating apps or fancy dinners to get to know someone. Your future spouse was picked for you, most likely by your parents or guardians, based on what was most beneficial for your family's wealth, social status, and land holdings. It wasn't uncommon for couples to have never met before the wedding day, and the idea of falling in love with someone before tying the knot. Not a chance. The union was about cementing power. Wealthy families, in particular, used marriage as a way to maintain or elevate their social standing. If you were a noble, you were expected to marry someone who could bring you the right connections, land, or even money. If you were a peasant, your family might have arranged a match to ensure you had access to better work opportunities, or to keep things in the family. So, in other words, your marriage was more about survival than romance. It was about aligning yourself with the right person to ensure your family's success, or, at least, to avoid losing everything. Now, let's not get too sentimental about the love part. Marriage was as much a matter of personal dignity as it was about land. In a time when survival was a daily concern, everything was about securing your future. And don't forget the dowry. This wasn't some charming little gift of jewels or a pretty dress. A dowry was a heavy financial exchange that could decide the future of both families. If your dowry wasn't impressive enough, you could be stuck in a marriage that didn't offer you much. And if you had a decent dowry, well, you'd at least be considered a good catch. It was an exchange of property, rights, and obligations. Historians still debate the degree to which people might have ever felt affection for their spouse. Were these arranged marriages the worst fate, or were they simply a reflection of the harsh realities of medieval life? Some argue that these unions were ultimately functional, while others think people found ways to make them work even without the luxury of emotional connection. But let's talk about the wedding itself. Imagine the pressure on the groom. Not only did you have to make sure the marriage was legally recognized by the church, but there was the matter of proving your worth on the wedding night. Sure, it's a lot of pressure, but the fact is, it was expected of you. If you couldn't perform in bed, the marriage could be annulled. Imagine the embarrassment. On top of all that, medieval honeymoons didn't include fancy beach resorts or even a comfortable bed. Instead, you might end up sharing a tiny, drafty room with your new spouse, dealing with the awkwardness and expectations of a union you never asked for. Your life wasn't your own anymore. It was about keeping the family legacy alive and making sure you produced heirs. That's right, children were the ultimate goal, and if you couldn't make it happen, you'd be looked down upon. Of course, this wasn't just about making sure you had kids to love and raise. It was about securing the future of your name. Sons were the ideal, as they were the ones who would inherit land and titles. Daughters, not so much. They were important, but they were married off, often for the same reasons as family alliances. If you were a woman, your worth was largely tied to your ability to bear children. But here's the kicker. If your husband didn't perform on the wedding night, there could be serious repercussions for both of you. There was no room for failure in the medieval marriage game. It's hard to imagine living in such a rigid system, where everything you did, everything you were, was determined by something as fundamental as your marriage contract. But in the medieval period, that was the reality. Every move you made could either secure your future or destroy it. So, as you move deeper into this strange world, it's worth remembering just how much was riding on this business deal. As we continue our journey into the world of medieval marriage, things are about to get even more uncomfortable. You've probably figured out by now that medieval life wasn't exactly filled with romance and smooth sailing. But there's one thing we need to talk about before we dive even deeper into the rituals and social pressures. The shocking lack of courtship. That's right, there were no getting to know you moments before the big day. The very idea of falling in love before marriage was a concept so foreign that it hardly even existed. Now, picture this. You're about to marry someone you've never spoken to in a meaningful way. The courtship process, as we know it today, didn't happen. Instead, marriages were arranged solely for practical reasons. If you were lucky, you might have gotten a little bit of time with your spouse before the wedding, but that was mostly just to arrange logistics and get to know each other's families. It was never about building a connection. There was no time for that. But wait. Things get even more interesting when you consider that the medieval view of marriage was deeply rooted in social and economic survival. If you were from a wealthy family, a proper courtship might involve elaborate arrangements and negotiations. However, for the common folk, it was all about pragmatism. Marrying for love was almost unheard of. Instead, you married to secure your place in society, maintain your family's wealth, or even secure land. So, instead of romantic dates or sweet moments, you were expected to look at your partner as a business deal and a life sentence. The medieval courtship, or lack thereof, wasn't necessarily a bad thing, depending on your perspective. If you were lucky enough to marry into a wealthy family, you could rest assured that your life would be comfortable and secure. On the flip side, if you didn't have that luxury, you might have found yourself in a miserable partnership. But remember, you couldn't back out of the deal. Divorce wasn't an option, and breaking a marriage contract was nearly impossible without severe consequences. Historians still argue whether the absence of courtship led to a higher divorce rate or whether it helped preserve stability. Some say that the lack of emotional attachment actually made marriage more manageable, while others believe it created a breeding ground for resentment. Either way, whether you had a choice in the matter or not, you were expected to fulfill your duties. Now, imagine the awkwardness of your first real conversation with your future spouse after the ceremony. It's strange to think about, but many medieval couples didn't even know how to communicate effectively with each other before they were married. Intimacy wasn't something that people learned about from their parents or friends. It was a private and often taboo subject. In fact, it was a source of shame for many, especially for women who were expected to be pure and untouched. So when the time came to be intimate, there was often confusion, fear, and a deep sense of obligation rather than joy or excitement. Your wedding night, Sperry, was supposed to mark the beginning of your married life. But for many, it felt more like an intimidating trial. A huge amount of pressure was placed on you to perform your duties as a spouse, whether or not you were physically or emotionally ready. The concept of mutual satisfaction is not really on the medieval agenda. Instead, the marriage was meant to produce heirs, and that was about it. The idea of love, passion, and personal pleasure was far from the mind of your new partner and, more often than not, yourself as well, in a way. The lack of courtship made the reality of the wedding night even more difficult to bear. With no true emotional connection between you and your spouse, the pressure to perform was even more intense. But here's the kicker. If either of you failed to meet the expectations, the consequences could be severe. Imagine the humiliation of being unable to consummate your marriage, knowing that the whole village might be gossiping about it. But let's talk about the cultural view of sex in medieval society. You see, people had a very different approach to intimacy than we do today. It was heavily influenced by religious beliefs and social norms. In many cases, sex was seen less as a source of pleasure and more as a necessary evil, something that needed to happen in order to fulfill your duty as a spouse and create heirs. Historians still debate whether this strict, duty-bound view of sex was an inevitable outcome of medieval society's structure, core, whether it could have been different under other circumstances. Some believe the Church's influence played a significant role in shaping people's attitudes towards sex and marriage. Others argue that it was simply a reflection of the times when survival, rather than emotional fulfillment, was the priority. Either way, the result was the same. Sex was a function, not a celebration. And that's something you'd quickly learn after your wedding night. Now that we've covered the awkward and downright uncomfortable realities of medieval marriages, let's shift gears and take a look at what awaited you on your wedding night. The moment when everything is supposed to start right. Well, not exactly. The consummation of the marriage, the all-important moment when you are supposed to seal the deal and produce heirs, wasn't the romantic, passion-filled encounter that we might imagine today. In fact, it was often a highly ritualized, somewhat awkward, and frequently unpleasant affair. On your wedding night, you weren't exactly left to your own devices. There was a lot riding on this event, and you knew it. This wasn't just about proving you could fulfill your marital duties. It was about your very survival in society. If you couldn't consummate the marriage, it could be annulled, and you'd be left with a lifetime of shame. That's a lot of pressure, right? It's the very idea of starting a life together felt like a daunting mountain to climb, especially when all eyes were on you to make sure things went according to plan. You and your spouse might have entered the marriage bed with different expectations. Maybe you were nervous, scared, or completely unaware of what was expected of you. Most likely, neither of you had the luxury of knowledge or comfort. Sex wasn't something that people talked about freely. There was no open discussion about pleasure or mutual satisfaction. For women, especially, sex was simply seen as a means of reproduction. To make matters worse, many medieval wedding nights involved a series of rituals to ensure that the marriage was consummated. In some cases, friends and family members would stand outside the couple's room, waiting for the sound of the marriage to be officially sealed. If there was any doubt about whether or not the marriage had been consummated, the couple would often have to go through a public ordeal to prove it. And believe me, that's a far cry from the private, intimate moments we take for granted today. But beyond the pressure to perform, there were a host of logistical challenges on the wedding night. The medieval bed was hardly a luxurious sanctuary. The sheets were rough, the blankets were thin, and the smell of unwashed bodies filled the air. It wasn't the kind of romantic atmosphere you might envision in modern times. In fact, the medieval bed was probably more of a survival tool than a place for pleasure. Many couples, especially those in colder climates, slept in beds shared with livestock to stay warm during the long, frigid nights. Can you imagine trying to be romantic when you're sharing your bed with a pig? Or worse, a cow? Now, let's get into the physical realities of the act itself. Medieval sex wasn't all that different from sex today, but the social and religious attitudes toward it made it a much more stressful experience. Sex was viewed as necessary, yes, but also a bit shameful. The church had a significant influence on people's views, teaching that sex was something to be endured rather than enjoyed, even if you were lucky enough to find a moment of passion. The prevailing attitudes toward sexuality meant that pleasure was secondary, if it was considered at all. Your job was to produce heirs, not to enjoy the moment. The anxiety around the wedding night was very real. You were expected to perform, to consummate the marriage, and to prove your worth to the world. There was no honeymoon period, no time to relax and get to know your spouse. Instead, It was a high-stakes event that could lead to the dissolution of your marriage if things didn't go as planned. Imagine the horror of being unable to seal the deal, knowing that your future depended on this one moment. That wasn't just awkward, it was terrifying. Historians still debate whether this pressure to perform on the wedding night made life harder for medieval couples, or whether it helped them forge deeper bonds. Some argue that the anxiety surrounding the consummation ceremony was just another way of controlling individuals, while others believe it helped couples understand the serious responsibility they were taking on by entering into marriage. Either way, it was an incredibly high-pressure environment, and let's not forget that the pressure didn't stop at the wedding night. Once the marriage was consummated, you were expected to quickly start producing heirs. The pressure to have children was immense, and it wasn't just about having a happy family. It was about ensuring the survival of your family's name, status, and property. If you couldn't produce heirs, your marriage could be deemed a failure, and that's not a reputation you want in medieval society. So, as you lay in that cold, uncomfortable bed, trying to make sense of what's expected of you, remember that your wedding night wasn't about joy or romance. It was about duty, obligation, and the ever-present fear of failure. And that was the harsh reality of marriage in medieval times. Let's take a step back and dive into something that might seem a little surprising to modern ears: medieval contraception. More accurately, the lack of reliable contraception. If you thought the medieval world was all about passionate love affairs and romantic gestures, think again. Instead, it was a time when people were constantly worried about the consequences of intimacy, especially when it came to avoiding pregnancy. But as you might imagine, medieval contraception was far from foolproof. Unlike today, when there's an entire industry devoted to birth control, medieval couples had to rely on rudimentary and often dangerous methods to avoid children. You'd think that in a time where survival was a daily struggle, people would want to control their reproduction. But, let's be honest, contraceptive methods were a bit of a gamble back then. Let's talk about some of the techniques people used. One of the most common methods was the use of barrier methods, though they were far from reliable. For women, this could mean using herbs or animal intestines to form a crude barrier to prevent pregnancy. It sounds incredibly uncomfortably. It was. But the reality is, these methods didn't work very well. A medieval woman could find herself pregnant time and time again because there was no foolproof way to avoid it. The idea of a woman getting pregnant after every sexual encounter was very real, especially considering how little control most people had over their reproductive lives. For men, the options weren't much better. Condoms, if they were even available, were often made from animal bladders or linen. These were not the latex wonders we know today. You could imagine how effective they were, spoiler alert. Not very. People also tried to use various herbal concoctions and potions to stop pregnancy. But many of these methods were based on superstition and guesswork rather than actual science. Some of these remedies were dangerous and could cause long-term health issues. Historians still argue whether the high number of pregnancies and the limited use of contraception was a direct result of medieval, social, and religious pressures, or simply a reflection of the lack of medical knowledge at the time. Some believe that the Church's stance on contraceptions strongly discouraging any attempts to prevent pregnancy was a major factor in why it was so hard for couples to escape the relentless cycle of childbirth. Others argue that there simply weren't many reliable methods to choose from, making the situation even more dire. Either way, it's clear that the odds of avoiding pregnancy weren't in your favor. The question becomes, why would anyone take such risks? The simple answer is, life was harsh. Most medieval people didn't have the luxury of choosing when or how many children they had. For the wealthy, it was important to have heirs, especially male heirs, to carry on the family name and land. For the poor, children were often seen as a necessity to help with labor and contribute to the family's survival. And even if you did manage to avoid pregnancy for a time, the risk of disease, famine, and infant mortality was so high that it almost didn't matter. You could spend your whole life trying to avoid pregnancy, only to see your child succumb to disease or die young. The reality of medieval life was that survival, both for you and your offspring, was a constant battle. But it wasn't just about avoiding pregnancy. It was about surviving the very act of sex. Medieval women had no guarantee that childbirth would go smoothly, and the dangers of both pregnancy and childbirth were very real. Many women died during childbirth, and those who survived were often left with long-term health problems. This made the prospect of even having children terrifying. For many women, the fear of pregnancy, childbirth, and the aftermath hung over them throughout their marriage. And let's not forget the pressure. If you didn't produce children, your marriage was considered a failure. No matter how much you loved your partner, if you couldn't produce an heir, your status was in jeopardy. You would face humiliation. And there was even the possibility that your marriage could be annulled. The pressure to have children, especially male children, was immense. You might have been lucky enough to get married, but whether you could fulfill your duty as a parent was an entirely different matter. And for women, there was always the looming fear of what would happen if you failed to meet these expectations. Historians still debate whether the pressure to bear children was more damaging for women in the medieval period than it was for men. Some believe that the focus on women's reproductive duties created an incredibly oppressive environment, while others suggest that men were equally burdened by the pressure to maintain the family name and produce heirs. Either way, the stakes were high, and the consequences of failure could be severe. So, as we think about medieval contraception, the picture becomes clear. It wasn't just about avoiding pregnancy, it was about avoiding disaster, and the methods available were often ineffective, dangerous, and riddled with superstition. In many ways, sex in medieval times was a game of chance, one that could cost you your life, your health, or your future. If you thought medieval contraception was bad, then get ready for the real shocker: medieval hygiene. Or rather, the lack of it. You may have heard that medieval people weren't exactly obsessed with cleanliness, but just how bad was it? Spoiler alert, it was a lot worse than you probably imagined. You see, personal hygiene wasn't a priority in the medieval world. Bathing, as we know it today, wasn't something that was part of everyday life. The idea of hopping into a hot shower or a relaxing bath after a long day was a luxury that simply didn't exist. For most people, the idea of cleaning up was more about survival than comfort. The wealthy had access to public baths or private bathhouses, but even they didn't take regular baths. For peasants, however, the situation was far worse. Baths were a rare occurrence, and hygiene was largely neglected. Let's break it down. For medieval men and women, washing your body wasn't part of the daily routine. Sure, you might wash your face and hands here and there, but a full body scrub down, that was a luxury that only the upper class could afford. For the rest of society, soap was a rare commodity, and water wasn't always easy to come by. It's hard to imagine the stench that must have filled the air, especially in cities and villages where overcrowding and unsanitary conditions were the norm. But the real kicker was hygiene when it came to sexual activity. Let's face it, without regular bathing, things weren't exactly fresh down there. Sex in medieval times was a whole different ballgame. The lack of personal hygiene meant that the very idea of intimacy could become a bit unpleasant. Imagine sharing a bed with your spouse who hasn't bathed in days, or maybe even weeks. It wasn't uncommon for people to sleep in the same clothes they wore during the day because, after all, washing those wasn't a priority either. This isn't just a gross thought, it was a real problem in medieval life. Now, let's get into the specifics of what medieval hygiene actually looked like. For starters, most medieval people didn't use toothpaste or toothbrushes. Instead, they'd clean their teeth with cloths, ash, or even twigs. That's right, no minty fresh breath after a long day. As for the rest of your body, well, you'd rely on a simple wash with water or, in some cases, a bath in a stream or river. It's hard to imagine how anyone could be comfortable living in such conditions, let alone engaging in something as intimate as sex. But then again, in medieval times, comfort wasn't exactly the top priority. Survival was. Historians still debate how much hygiene or the lack of it affected people's overall health and relationships during this period. Some argue that people in the medieval world had a higher tolerance for unpleasant smells and uncleanliness than we do today, while others believe that the spread of disease and infection was partly due to this lack of hygiene. There's also the question of whether the lack of concern for personal cleanliness made medieval people less aware of the importance of sexual health. It's possible that the combination of poor hygiene and the high rates of sexual activity contributed to the rapid spread of diseases like syphilis, which ravaged Europe during this time. But hygiene wasn't just about avoiding illness. It was also about social status. You see, if you were wealthy, you had access to better living conditions and, in theory, better hygiene. The rich could afford to have cleaner clothes, use perfumes, and attend public baths. But for the poor, it was a constant struggle. Your social standing was often tied to how clean or dirty you appeared. And that was something that couldn't be ignored in the medieval world. So, as you think about what sex was like in medieval times, remember this. It wasn't just about performance, duty, or reproduction. It was about trying to make do with what little you had. The lack of hygiene made intimacy a lot less appealing, to say the least. The smells, the discomfort, the constant fear of disease, these were all realities that medieval couples faced every time they got into bed together. Historians continue to debate whether people in the medieval period were more or less concerned about their hygiene than we are today. Were they just used to living in filth, or did they actually have a different standard of cleanliness? And how much did this affect their personal lives, their health, and their relationships? One thing is for sure, medieval hygiene was not something you'd want to experience firsthand. It's a wonder anyone survived it, let alone thrived. As we continue to peel back the layers of medieval sex life, we need to take a moment to talk about sexual health, because, let's face it, health in medieval times was a whole different ballgame. Forget about modern medicine and the range of remedies we have today. When it came to sex and everything surrounding it, medieval people were largely on their own. If something went wrong in the bedroom, whether it was a disease, injury, or complication from childbirth, chances are you were stuck with whatever treatment the local healer could offer, which often meant strange potions and downright bizarre remedies. First, let's address the obvious: sexually transmitted diseases. Even back in the medieval period, diseases like syphilis, gonorrhea, and chlamydia were making their rounds, and people were just as clueless about them as we are today when it comes to their spread and treatment. The concept of germs was not yet understood, so people had no idea why these diseases spread, nor did they know how to treat them effectively. In fact, medieval treatments for STDs were often rooted in superstition, magic, and some of the oddest concoctions you could imagine. For example, syphilis, which wasn't even properly identified as a disease until much later, was treated with mercurius. Mercury, the toxic metal. Then there was the issue of childbirth. As we mentioned earlier, childbirth was a dangerous endeavor in medieval times. It wasn't just a case of discomfort. It was literally life and death for many women. Mortality rates were extremely high because medical knowledge about pregnancy and childbirth was severely lacking. Childbirth was often handled by midwives who had little to no training, relying on a combination of folk remedies, prayers, and whatever limited knowledge they had inherited from generations before them. And if complications arose, you were often out of luck. It wasn't uncommon for women to die in childbirth, and even if they survived, the toll on their bodies could be severe. But what about treating sexual injuries or infections that weren't related to childbirth? Well, medieval medicine had some really strange approaches. You might be prescribed a poultice made of herbs and animal dung to draw out the infection, or perhaps some sort of potion made of animal blood or other questionable ingredients. Of course, none of these remedies were particularly effective. In fact, many of them did more harm than good. In addition to the regular physical discomfort and pain, people were forced to endure treatments that were as likely to kill them as cure them. The connection between sexual health and disease was never really made until much later in history. And by then, medieval doctors had already done their worst. Infections, like gonorrhea, could lead to infertility, but there were no real treatments for it. Penicillin and antibiotics were centuries away. If you contracted an STD, you simply had to deal with it and hope it didn't get worse. And if you were lucky enough to survive, you were left with a body ravaged by these diseases and injuries, all without the hope of effective treatment. Historians still debate just how bad the situation was when it came to sexual health. Some argue that medieval people were more resilient to disease because they simply had no other option but to live with it, while others believe that the lack of medical knowledge and treatment made these diseases far worse than they had to be. Some scholars even suggest that the high mortality rate in the medieval period was a direct result of the lack of access to health care and the dangerous, tentative methods used to treat these issues. One of the more curious aspects of medieval medicine was the use of magic in treating sexual health issues. Many people, especially in rural areas, turned to folk remedies and magic spells to deal with sexual dysfunction, infertility, or sexually transmitted diseases. Some of these remedies involved carrying around an amulet or charm that was supposed to protect you from disease. Others included elaborate rituals to cure impotence or infertility. But, as you can imagine, these superstitions didn't exactly do much for your health, and often they made things worse. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like to live in a world where your sexual health was entirely dependent on luck, folklore, and the occasionally unreliable local healer. You could have an ailment or disease that today we would easily cure with a trip to the doctor, but back then you were left to suffer in silence, with little hope of relief. And if you were a woman, you were even more vulnerable, because there wasn't even a chance to get proper care during pregnancy, childbirth, or any related complications. Historians still argue over the extent to which medieval people were aware of the risks associated with sexual activity and what they could have done to avoid them. Some believe that people were more likely to hide their problems or suffer in silence due to the immense social stigma surrounding sexual health. Others suggest that, despite the limited medical knowledge, people were resourceful and found ways to cope with their issues, even if the solutions weren't always effective. Either way, one thing is clear: sexual health in the medieval period was a risky business, and the odds were rarely in your favor. We've covered the awkward realities of medieval marriage, the immense pressure surrounding it, and the lack of hygiene. But there's one major player that we haven't talked about yet: the church. In medieval times, the church had a profound influence on nearly every aspect of life, including sex. And when it came to your intimate life, let me tell you, the church had a lot to say about what was allowed and what was sinful. Now, we've already touched on the fact that sex wasn't exactly viewed as a source of pleasure. It was more about reproduction, especially when it came to marriage. But here's the kicker: the church viewed sex as a necessary evil. According to medieval theology, sex was something that had to happen within the confines of marriage, but it was only allowed for one purpose: to produce children. Any other form of sex was considered a sin. So, if you were planning on using sex for fun, or for anything other than having kids, well, you were probably going to hell. Let's pause for a second and think about that. You're married, you're expected to reproduce, and the church is telling you that the only reason you're allowed to have sex is to create heirs. This takes the romance out of sex, doesn't it? There's no room for fun, no room for mutual enjoyment. It's just about fulfilling your duty to society, your family, and the church. The fact that people still found ways to enjoy themselves despite this religious pressure is a testament to human nature. But it certainly wasn't the ideal. The church's views on sex went even further, extending to what was considered moral behavior. For instance, masturbation was strictly forbidden, as were any forms of sexual activity outside of marriage. There was no such thing as casual sex in medieval times. If you weren't married, you weren't having sex, period. The church condemned any form of sexual expression outside of the marital bed. But let's not forget the huge power imbalance that the church maintained. The church didn't just dictate sexual behavior, it controlled it. If you were a woman, the church's teachings about sex were even harsher. Women were often viewed as sinful and tempting, and their sexual desires were seen as dangerous. The church reinforced the idea that women existed solely for the purpose of reproduction, and their sexual pleasure was not only unnecessary but also immoral. This led to some pretty miserable realities for women who had little or no say in their marital lives. Historians still argue about the extent to which the church's teachings influenced medieval sexual practices. Was it the church's condemnation of sexual pleasure that caused such a rigid and repressive view of sex, or was it simply a reflection of the times? Some believe that the church's authority on matters of the body and sexuality created an environment where people were made to feel shameful about their natural desires. Others argue that the church's teachings helped keep society stable by maintaining strict rules about sexuality and family life. Regardless of the perspective, one thing is clear: the church had an immense influence on medieval sexual morality. Sexuality in the medieval period was complicated, to say the least. On the one hand, you had a church that reinforced the idea that sex was only for reproduction, that it was inherently sinful unless done for the right reasons. On the other hand, you had human nature, which often found ways to push back against these teachings. Yet, the fear of hell and the constant pressure to follow church doctrine kept many people in check. And for those who dared to deviate from the norm, there were harsh punishments to deal with. Let's not even get into the fact that the church had an overwhelming influence on the legal system as well. If you were accused of infidelity or sexual sin, the church often played a major role in determining your punishment. Depending on the severity of your transgression, punishments could range from public shaming to severe bodily harm. The church also had a say in whether or not your marriage was considered legitimate, and if it wasn't, you could find yourself excommunicated or worse. It's easy to see how people were constantly walking on eggshells when it came to their sexual lives. Historians still debate how much of an impact the church's teachings on sexuality had on everyday life in medieval times. Some argue that the rigid sexual morality enforced by the church led to widespread guilt and shame, while others suggest that these teachings helped create a stable social order, where people understood their roles within the family and society. Either way, it's hard to ignore the immense power the church held when it came to dictating what was moral or immoral in the bedroom. In the end, the church's influence on medieval sexuality was one of control, fear, and repression. The church made sure you knew your place and your duty when it came to sex, but it wasn't about enjoyment. It was about obligation. Pleasure was secondary, and even the mere thought of it was something to be ashamed of. Let's dive into something that may make you rethink the idea of medieval purity, the concept of virginity. Today, in modern society, we often associate virginity with a symbolic sense of purity, or a rite of passage into adulthood. But in medieval times, things were a bit different. Virginity wasn't necessarily about personal experience. It was about ownership, control, and societal expectations. In fact, the medieval concept of virginity was a lot more complex than we typically imagine. First off, it's important to understand that virginity was primarily a social construct. Your value, especially as a woman, was often tied to your virginity. But here's the thing. It wasn't always about your personal choice or moral virtue. It was about your family's reputation, marriage negotiations, and, of course, the transfer of your body from one man, your father or guardian, to another, your husband. If you were a virgin, you were considered valuable in the marriage market because you were untouched, or, medieval terms, unspoiled. In many ways, a woman's virginity was a family asset, and it was meant to be guarded until the wedding night, when it would be handed over to the husband. The concept of virginity wasn't about preserving a woman's inner sense of purity. Was about ensuring that she had never been touched by another man, preserving her ability to secure a good match and to pass on legitimate heirs. Now, let's talk about the wedding night. Remember that awkward, pressure-filled moment? Well, if you were a woman, there was an additional layer of expectation. Not only were you expected to consummate the marriage, but you were also expected to prove your virginity. The idea was that your husband needed to be sure you hadn't been with anyone else. So there were a variety of tests to determine whether you were truly a virgin. Some of these tests were shockingly invasive and completely absurd by modern standards. For instance, in some cultures, the groom would inspect the bride's body for signs of sexual activity. And if there were any signs of deflowering, the marriage could be annulled. Imagine the humiliation of being publicly scrutinized in such an intimate way. But here's the truly bizarre part. Virginity wasn't just about actual experience. It was a symbol, a metaphor. The church played a huge role in shaping this symbol, reinforcing the idea that a woman's body was a vessel of purity until she was married. Even if you weren't a virgin, some medieval texts still treated the concept as a kind of mystical or religious purity. The idea of virginity wasn't always tied to whether or not a woman had ever had sex. It was a reflection of her status, and value. It wasn't just women who were caught up in the obsession with virginity. Men, too, were expected to prove their virility and ability to perform. If a man couldn't consummate the marriage, he could face embarrassment, ridicule, or even the annulment of the marriage. The stakes were high for both partners. The pressure to perform wasn't just on the woman, it was on both of you. So, while you might have been nervously wondering if you'd meet expectations, your new spouse was likely just as anxious. Historians still argue about the true meaning of virginity in medieval society. Was it a concept that really mattered to people in their daily lives? Or was it a social construct perpetuated by the church to control relationships and marriages? Some historians believe that the notion of virginity was a tool used by the church to maintain control over women's bodies, while others suggest that it was more about ensuring legitimate heirs and preserving family lines. Either way, the pressure surrounding virginity was immense, and it was tied directly to the institution of marriage. The importance of virginity was not limited to marriage. It also extended to the religious and social status of women. Virginity was often associated with holiness. In medieval Christian culture, virginity became an idealized trait, closely linked to saints and the Virgin Mary herself. Virgin martyrs were celebrated, and women who maintained their virginity were often revered. But this idealization came at a cost. Women who lost their virginity before marriage were often seen as impure or dishonorable, and their futures were bleak. In some cases, women who lost their virginity outside of marriage were cast aside by their families and ostracized by society. Even though the concept of virginity played a huge role in medieval life, the reality was far messier than the ideal. People didn't live in a black and white world where virginity could be neatly defined. Affairs, illicit relationships, and infidelity were common, yet the concept of virginity persisted as a kind of social armor to preserve honor and reputation. For you, as a medieval person, if you were unmarried and found to have had sex, it could be disastrous. Your future would be severely limited. But if you are married, the importance of virginity extended to your new life as well. It wasn't just about your body anymore. It was about your family's reputation, your role in society, and the political alliances that came with your marriage. So, in the end, the concept of virginity in medieval times wasn't just a simple matter of purity, was a matter of control, power, and social status. And if you were caught on the wrong side of it, you'd quickly find that your place in society could become very precarious indeed. So, you've married, you've consummated, and perhaps you're starting to feel a little bit of pressure. Because here's the thing, in medieval times, marriage was about much more than just coexisting, it was about reproducing. And not just any reproduction, but producing heirs, preferably male ones. This was not just about your personal fulfillment or happiness. It was about securing the future of your family, your title, and your property. You were a cog in a larger machine, and your role was clear. Bear children, especially sons, or risk being labeled a failure. It didn't matter how much you liked or disliked your spouse, or how romantic the idea of family life seemed. The stakes were incredibly high. You had one job: to produce heirs who could inherit the land, titles, and wealth of the family. If you were lucky, your spouse might also have a desire to produce children, but if not, well, the pressure was squarely on your shoulders. If you couldn't get pregnant, or if you couldn't deliver a healthy child, your marriage could be called into question. There was no room for just trying in the medieval world. You either produced a healthy heir, or you faced significant consequences. For men, the pressure to produce a male heir was just as intense. In medieval society, sons were prized because they were the ones who could carry on the family name and inherit the family wealth. Daughters. They might be valuable in certain ways, like making alliances through marriage, but they weren't the heirs. If you failed to produce a male heir, you could risk your family's future. This was a time when family lines and legacies were everything, and everything hinged on the success of your children. So, your marriage wasn't just about love or compatibility, it was about ensuring that the next generation would carry the torch for your family. Let's be honest, though having children wasn't as simple as it sounds. In fact, medieval people had no clue about the biological processes behind conception. Sure, they knew that sex led to babies, but they didn't understand the science behind it. There was no reliable birth control, and no clear understanding of why some couples couldn't conceive. Many couples tried for years to have children, sometimes only to face heartbreaking miscarriages or stillbirths. The stress and anxiety surrounding childbirth were immense. Women often faced multiple pregnancies, only to lose their children or die in the process. And even if they survived childbirth, there was no guarantee that they would be able to care for their children. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high, and it was a constant battle to see which children would survive long enough to inherit the family estate. In the medieval world, being unable to have children wasn't just disappointing, it was a calamity. If a woman couldn't bear children, her marriage might be annulled. For men, the pressure to father a child, especially a son, was just as intense. Men weren't only responsible for ensuring their family's future, they were expected to prove their virility and strength. If they couldn't perform, it was considered a mark of shame. And that wasn't something you wanted hanging over your head, especially when your family's entire legacy depended on it. Historians still debate how much pressure medieval couples faced to produce heirs, and whether it was ever possible for them to enjoy the process of reproduction. Some suggest that the importance of heirs might have stifled the possibility of any true intimacy or enjoyment in marriage. After all, the goal was never about pleasure. It was about ensuring that your family line survived and thrived. Others argue that, despite the pressure, many couples found ways to form bonds and navigate the pressures of reproduction. Either way, the pressure to reproduce wasn't just something that people lived with something they lived for. There were also strange and sometimes oppressive social expectations about childbirth. In some cases, women were required to give birth in public or with witnesses to prove that the child was indeed legitimate. The church, with its influence over marriage and family, also had its say in the matter of reproduction. Childbirth, especially the birth of legitimate heirs, was a public affair that had to meet strict standards of legitimacy. The church, in particular, played a significant role in determining whether children were legitimate, and whether a marriage could be considered valid. For women, especially, the pressure to reproduce could be suffocating. A woman's value was often measured by her ability to bear children. If she couldn't, or worse, if she produced only daughters, it could lead to shame, rejection, or even divorce. The concept of infertility in medieval times was a grim one. Medical knowledge about fertility was practically non-existent, and most couples didn't know how to address the issue. Sometimes it was blamed on the woman, sometimes on the man. But the result was always the same. If you couldn't produce a male heir, you were in serious trouble. So when you think about sex in the medieval world, it's not just about desire, it's about duty. You weren't just having sex for pleasure or intimacy. You were doing it because you had no choice. You had to fulfill your role in the family, in society, and in the larger game of politics. If you couldn't do that, you were failing not just yourself, but everyone around you. And when it came to reproducing, failure wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a threat to your survival. As we dive deeper into the medieval approach to sex and marriage, there's a darker side we need to address: infidelity. In today's world, cheating might be a source of personal heartbreak and relationship strain. But in medieval times, infidelity had much more severe consequences, often impacting not just the couple involved, but entire families, estates, and even political alliances. Remember, this wasn't just about romantic betrayal. It was about the survival of your name, reputation, and legacy. The stakes were incredibly high. In many ways, infidelity was considered not only a betrayal of your spouse, but also a crime against the family and society. In a world where marriage was less about personal happiness and more about securing alliances, having an affair could be seen as a direct attack on those alliances. The legitimacy of heirs was paramount. If you had an affair and your spouse bore no children, or worse, bore children who weren't biologically yours, it could undermine your entire lineage. For the elite, cheating could disrupt the very foundations of your family's wealth, title, and land holdings. And for women, in particular, being caught in an affair could be disastrous. Women, in medieval society, were often expected to remain loyal, not just for personal or moral reasons, but because of the societal and legal repercussions of betrayal. If you were married, your fidelity was seen as a reflection of your family's honor. A woman caught cheating could face harsh punishment, including public shame, divorce, and sometimes even death. The double standard was glaring. While men could sometimes get away with infidelity as long as it didn't lead to illegitimate heirs, women had far fewer opportunities to escape punishment. In fact, in some cases, women who were caught cheating were subjected to brutal corporal punishment. But it wasn't just women who were held to these high standards of fidelity. Men, too, had their own set of expectations, though in their case, the rules were a little more lenient. A cage, men could sometimes indulge in affairs without facing the same social consequences. Cage, however, if they fathered illegitimate children, especially sons, it could ruin their inheritance plans and complicate succession. The idea of illegitimate children was a serious concern, especially in the noble classes, where maintaining a pure family line was essential for keeping land and titles intact. But still, the penalties for men weren't as harsh. For women, even a rumor of infidelity could lead to devastating consequences. While men were often allowed to maintain their status and reputation as long as they didn't disrupt the social order. This disparity wasn't just about personal relationships. It had political ramifications. For nobles and royalty, infidelity could be a matter of life and death. The legitimacy of heirs could determine the future of kingdoms, and a scandalous affair could lead to the overthrow of a dynasty. The history of medieval Europe is littered with instances where infidelity or suspected infidelity led to wars, rebellions, and the destruction of entire families. Imagine living under that kind of pressure, knowing that your marriage wasn't just about you and your spouse, but about the survival of your entire family line. Historians still debate the role of infidelity in medieval marriages. Was it as rampant as some might believe? Or was it something that people kept secret in fear of punishment? Some scholars suggest that infidelity was surprisingly common, especially among the nobility, where the pressure to produce heirs was so intense that many men sought solace outside of their marriages. Others believe that the fear of societal judgment and harsh legal consequences kept many couples loyal, or at least careful. Either way, Infidelity was a dangerous game to play in medieval times. But, as we've learned, the rules were very different for those in power. Royal families and aristocrats had the means to indulge in affairs without fear of the same level of punishment. In some cases, kings had mistresses, and their mistresses had their own political power. This created a double standard while common people were bound by strict rules of fidelity. The rich and powerful had the freedom to step outside those boundaries with little consequence. Of course, there were exceptions, and in some cases, powerful men and women faced enormous scandals when their affairs became public. But overall, the elite had more leeway when it came to infidelity. The problem of illegitimacy remained a constant issue for those in power. In cases where a nobleman or a king fathered a child outside of marriage, there was often a serious battle for inheritance rights. These illegitimate children were often excluded from the family estate, and their status was always in question. But if the affair was kept secret, or if the affair resulted in a legitimate heir, the political consequences were far less dire. The real concern was the potential for division within the family and the risk of civil conflict over succession. So, whether you were a commoner or a noble, infidelity was not something to take lightly. It could destroy lives, ruin reputations, and wreak havoc on entire families. The stakes were incredibly high, and the social, legal, and political consequences were severe. Infidelity wasn't just a private matter, it was a public scandal, with far-reaching effects. And for medieval people, that made the act of cheating more dangerous than you might think. By now, you've probably noticed that sex in medieval times was a lot more complicated than just intimate moments between two people. It was tangled with power, duty, and, of course, societal expectations. One of the most fascinating and, perhaps, disturbing parts of medieval sexuality was how it was shaped by strict gender roles and power dynamics. Medieval sex wasn't about mutual enjoyment. It was about reinforcing these very power structures, with women often at the bottom of the hierarchy. Let's start with the role of women in the bedroom. Medieval society viewed women as vessels for reproduction, and that was about it. Women had little to no agency when it came to their sexual lives, and they were expected to submit to their husbands in every sense of the word. Marriage was seen as a woman's primary role in life, and once you entered that contract, your sexual life was dictated by the expectations of society. Your husband and, of course, the church. You were there to produce children, particularly male heirs, and that was your function. If your husband desired sex, it was your duty to comply. Pleasure, that was secondary, at best. Now, if you were a man, the dynamics were very different. As a man, you were expected to assert dominance in the relationship, and that extended into the sexual realm. Men were the ones who were expected to take charge, to initiate sex, and to expect their wives to submit to them. This wasn't just a matter of personal desire, it was about maintaining control over the family unit and the wife's body. Your masculinity was measured in part by your ability to perform sexually and by your control over your wife's body. In fact, many men felt a sense of entitlement to their wives' sexuality, as if it was their property to do with as they pleased. But it wasn't just about who had the power. The sexual dynamics were also influenced by the concept of sexual purity. Women were expected to remain virgins until marriage, and once married, their sexual lives were largely governed by what was seen as acceptable within the confines of the marriage bed. For men, however, things were a little more flexible. Men often had the ability to have affairs or indulge in other forms of sexual pleasure, even outside of marriage. This double standard existed because of the deeply ingrained idea that men's desires were natural, while women's desires were to be suppressed. Women weren't supposed to enjoy sex, they were supposed to endure it. In some cases, this unequal power dynamic extended into the realm of sexual violence. While it's difficult to generalize, there were instances of sexual violence being normalized in medieval society. A wife, for example, had little to no legal protection if her husband decided to force himself upon her. The idea of marital rape was, essentially, non-existent. If you were married, you were expected to comply with your husband's wishes, regardless of your own feelings. The legal system didn't view women as autonomous individuals with sexual rights. They were simply property, and that property was expected to perform its duties. Historians still debate whether this power dynamic was more extreme in the medieval period than in other eras, or whether it was simply a reflection of the deeply patriarchal society in which medieval people lived. Some argue that medieval attitudes toward marriage and sex were more oppressive for women than in later periods, while others suggest that gender inequality was pervasive throughout history. What is clear, though, is that the medieval period was marked by a rigid, patriarchal system that defined sexual relationships as a means to uphold male authority and control. This power imbalance was reinforced by religious teachings, which provided the moral framework for sexual conduct. The Church taught that women were morally weaker than men, and that they needed the guidance and protection of men to keep them in check. The idea of original sin was often used to justify the idea that women were more prone to sexual temptation and sin than men. Women, therefore, needed to be controlled, not just for the sake of their own salvation, but for the good of society. Men were the protectors and the dominant figures in these relationships. At the same time, however, there were certain rules of sexual conduct that applied to both genders. Adultery, for example, was considered a sin for both men and women, although the punishment for women was far harsher. If a woman committed adultery, she could be subjected to public shame, physical punishment, or even death. For men, adultery was typically less severe, especially if it didn't result in any illegitimate heirs. The rules surrounding sexual conduct were, therefore, heavily gendered and rooted in the need to maintain social order, but beyond the question of power and control. Medieval sexuality was also affected by the very real fears of disease transmission, and even madness. The widespread fear of sexually transmitted diseases, like syphilis, meant that medieval people had a complicated relationship with sex. On the one hand, it was necessary to maintain the family line and fulfill marital duties. On the other hand, there were constant concerns about contracting diseases that could ruin your health or even kill you. At the same time, mental health was poorly understood, and many people believed that certain sexual behaviors, or the act of engaging in sex outside of marriage, could lead to madness or spiritual damnation. Historians still argue about how much sexual activity in the medieval period was influenced by these fears, and whether they contributed to the social and moral codes that governed behavior. Some believe that these fears about disease and madness led to a rigid, fearful approach to sex, while others argue that medieval people found ways to navigate these dangers with a surprising level of flexibility. Either way, it's clear that the medieval approach to sex wasn't just about pleasure, it was about navigating a world filled with fear, danger, and strict social norms. At this point, we've explored the oppressive realities of medieval sex, the rigid power structures, and the various fears and dangers lurking in the background. But there was something else at play during this period, fascinating, often surprising. Side of sexuality that might not immediately come to mind: medieval kinks and sexual fantasies. Sure, it might sound strange to think of medieval people as having a sexual imagination, but the truth is, they were just as likely to engage in fantasies, fetishes, and strange desires as people today. They just didn't have the vocabulary to talk about it quite the same way. Sex wasn't only about fulfilling societal duties or producing heirs. People, just like you and me, sometimes craved something a little more unusual. You might imagine that in such a rigid society, sexual experimentation or even fantasies would be completely taboo, but that wasn't the case. The church and social norms might have tried to repress desire, but human nature found ways to break through those walls, from historical texts to the occasional piece of artwork. Evidence suggests that medieval people had their fair share of unconventional sexual interests. In fact, we can look back on some medieval writings, and even some art, to see that people weren't just thinking about reproduction, they were thinking about other ways to spice things up. Some records suggest that medieval people had specific preferences for certain types of sexual acts. For example, the concept of role-playing wasn't exactly new. Medieval couples sometimes used costumes or personas during sex. The notion of domination and submission, though framed in terms of duty, might also have found an outlet in personal, private moments. In some cases, even medieval texts, though heavily censored by the church, hint at the interest in more unconventional, non-reproductive forms of intimacy. Of course, medieval kinks weren't always spoken about directly, due to the influence of the church's teachings on sexuality. But you can still find small clues about how people might have pushed the boundaries of societal norms. The concept of sexual fantasies and fetishes existed, but the language we use today didn't apply. Instead, medieval people would express these interests through euphemisms, metaphors, or coded language in poetry or private letters. And then, there's this strange history of courtly love. While it was mostly an idealized notion of unattainable love between knights and ladies, it wasn't always about virtue and honor. Sometimes, courtly love also played with sexual tension and unfulfilled desire. Knights would often serve as loyal lovers to married women, or women who were already promised to other men. And while their love was supposed to be chaste, there were often moments of passionate longing or implied sexual tension. These unconsummated relationships, while often symbolic, would undoubtedly have stoked the flames of sexual desire, both for the participants and the audience of these stories. But let's not get too carried away here. Medieval society was still grounded in religious morality. Any sexual activity outside of marriage was seen as sinful, and the consequences could be severe. That's why medieval sexuality, despite its occasional foray into fantasies and fetishes, was still very much defined by its need to conform to the strict rules set by the church. Anything that strayed too far from reproduction and the natural order of things could easily lead to shame, punishment, or even excommunication. Historians still argue about the prevalence of sexual fantasies during this time. Some suggest that these desires were largely suppressed, hidden beneath layers of societal expectations, while others believe that medieval people found ways to explore these interests, even in a repressive society. One of the most interesting debates centers around how much people actually understood their own desires. Did medieval people, under all the layers of repression, have the same capacity for sexual imagination as we do today? Or were their desires shaped by the incredibly strict rules governing their lives? Regardless of how people defined their desires, one thing is clear. Human sexuality wasn't something that could be completely suppressed. Despite the harsh moral codes and restrictions, The urge to explore and express sexual needs and desires was ever present. Even in medieval times, where everything from love to lust had to pass through the filter of social expectation, people were still finding ways to satisfy themselves, whether it was through the written word, art, or personal encounters. So as strange as it may seem, medieval people weren't always just worried about fulfilling their marital duties. They, too, had the same strange, wonderful, and complicated feelings that we have today. And despite all the repression, restrictions, and societal controls, their sexual fantasies managed to sneak through, just waiting to be expressed in different forms. Whether through the poems of courtly love, the hidden meaning in stories, or the whispered desires of those who dared to step outside the lines. Medieval sexuality was not as simple as it might seem. Historians still debate the extent to which medieval people were aware of their own sexual desires. Did they recognize their fantasies as something personal? Or did they simply act within the constraints of a society that repressed those desires? Some argue that the repression itself gave rise to these hidden desires, while others suggest that they existed all along, buried under layers of cultural and religious norms. What is clear, however, is that, like today, medieval people were no strangers to the complexity of sexual desire. As we near the end of our journey into medieval sexuality, it's time to look at the ultimate question. How did this strange, oppressive, and complex sexual landscape affect people's lives? And how did it ultimately end? Despite all the rules, regulations, and dangers surrounding sex, people still found ways to push back against the norms. But the changes in society's views on sex weren't sudden. They were a slow, gradual shift that happened over centuries. By the end of the medieval period, especially as we entered the Renaissance, the rigid structures of medieval sexuality began to loosen. New ideas about humanism, the body, and personal autonomy started to emerge, while the Church still wielded enormous power, and the traditional views of sexuality remained influential. People began to question the oppressive structures that had defined medieval sexual norms for so long. For women, however, the transition to a new era didn't mean an immediate improvement in sexual autonomy. While some areas saw slight improvements in women's rights, particularly in terms of property and legal status, the patriarchal structures that dictated sexual relationships didn't suddenly vanish. Women were still largely regarded as property within marriage, and their sexual rights were still defined by their reproductive roles. What changed, however, is the growing recognition that sexuality could be about pleasure as well as reproduction. Though that shift didn't necessarily mean that women had more control over their bodies. In the realm of marriage, the idea of romantic love began to take root. While this was still far from the modern concept of a relationship built on mutual affection, the idea that marriage could be about companionship and not just reproduction started to gain some traction. As the Renaissance rolled in, literature and art began to explore the idea of love and desire in ways that were unprecedented in the medieval world. Even so, sex was still largely about duty, especially for women. The social expectation to marry and produce heirs didn't disappear, but the language surrounding love, intimacy, and sex began to shift. But let's not romanticize the shift too much. This wasn't a sudden liberation from the oppression of medieval norms. It took centuries for the idea of personal consent, sexual freedom, and autonomy to develop into something closer to what we understand today. The social structure of marriage, for example, was still tightly controlled by family, religious, and political institutions well into the modern era. Women's rights, particularly in matters of marriage and sexuality, would continue to be restricted for a long time. In the meantime, the power of the church over personal sexual conduct started to diminish as Europe transitioned into the Renaissance and then into the Enlightenment. People began questioning the church's authority on all matters, including sex and marriage. This led to a slow but steady unraveling of the medieval sexual paradigm. Philosophers and thinkers of the Enlightenment started to challenge traditional ideas about gender roles, sexual morality, and the nature of human desire. While these changes would take centuries to fully manifest, the foundation was being laid for the sexual liberation movements that would follow much later. But the road from medieval repression to modern sexual freedoms was long and complicated. It wasn't as if the medieval sexual order simply fell apart. Rather, it was a gradual, sometimes painful evolution as society began to embrace ideas of personal rights, individual autonomy, and the concept of consent. It would be centuries before we saw significant changes in how people approached sex, and the journey from a repressive society to one where sexual rights are more widely recognized is still ongoing in many parts of the world. Historians still argue about when the real shift happened and how significant the changes were. Some suggest that the Protestant Reformation was the first crack in the foundation of medieval sexual repression, while others point to the scientific and philosophical advancements of the Enlightenment as the turning point. What's clear, however, is that by the time we reach the modern era, sex, marriage, and relationships had undergone a profound transformation from the medieval period. People began to ask questions that were once unthinkable questions about sexual rights, personal autonomy, and the nature of intimacy. And yet, even as society began to embrace new ideas about sex, much of the old medieval sexual framework remained in place for a long time. Gender inequality, sexual repression, and the view of sex as a duty rather than a pleasure persisted well into the modern era. Only now are we beginning to fully understand the complexities of sexual autonomy, consent, and freedom. So, as you reflect on the medieval period, it's important to understand that sex wasn't just an isolated experience. It was a reflection of the larger social, political, and religious structures of the time. Sex was about power, control, survival, and reproduction. And the personal pleasures and desires we often take for granted today were often sidelined by the harsh realities of medieval life. Despite the heavy weight of religious and social norms, people still managed to carve out spaces for desire, fantasy, and intimacy. These small rebellions against the status quo paved the way for the sexual freedoms we now enjoy, even if it took hundreds of years to get there. And so, as we look back on medieval sex, we see not just a time of repression and control, but also a time of subtle resistance, one where human nature found a way to survive and, in some cases, thrive despite the rigid structures of the world around it. Let's take a moment to reflect on something that many of us today might take for granted: the concept of sexual consent. In medieval times, the very idea of consent as we understand it today didn't really exist. Relationships were governed by duty, social standing, and religious dictates, not by mutual agreement. For many people, especially women, sex wasn't something to be negotiated. It was something that was expected. If you were a woman, your body wasn't truly your own, it belonged to your husband, your family, and in many cases, to the church. In medieval society, the idea of sexual consent wasn't just about agreeing to or refusing sex. It was a matter of your role in life. Your consent, as a woman, was often irrelevant. As a wife, You were expected to comply with your husband's desires, and refusal wasn't considered an option. The very notion of marital rape didn't exist because, under medieval law and Christian doctrine, your sexual rights were subordinated to those of your husband. Your body was viewed as a tool for reproduction and for upholding family honor, as something to be owned by you. Now, for men, consent didn't really figure into the equation either. The medieval concept of masculinity was often tied to sexual conquest. A man's masculinity was defined by his ability to dominate sexually, especially within marriage. Your sexual power as a man was measured not just by your ability to perform, but by your ability to maintain control over your wife's body and produce children. There wasn't a lot of room for the idea of mutual consent or even mutual pleasure. Instead, men were expected to take charge, and women were expected to submit. The pressure on women to submit to their husband's sexual demands was enormous. And it wasn't just about marital relations, it extended to the larger social framework as well. Medieval women were expected to maintain their chastity until marriage, and to remain obedient and submissive once they were married. In fact, the idea of a woman expressing desire or enjoyment in sex was considered unnatural. Women were thought to be lesser in matters of sexuality, their bodies seen as something to be controlled, not something with independent desires. Historians still debate the level of agency medieval women had in their sexual lives. Some argue that the lack of a concept of consent led to an oppressive environment where women were completely subjugated in their marriages. Others suggest that women, in some cases, found ways to express their desires, even if they had to do so under the guise of social and religious expectations. Some texts suggest that some women found ways to navigate the rigid sexual norms of the time. But the general consensus remains that medieval women had very little control over their own sexual lives at the same time. The Church played an incredibly important role in shaping ideas about sexual consent and morality. Religious authorities taught that women's sexuality was inherently sinful, and that it was the duty of men to control it. Women were taught that their bodies existed to serve the needs of their husbands, and that sexual pleasure was not meant to be shared equally. The Church's teachings reinforced the idea that women had no rights to their bodies beyond reproduction. In fact, sex for pleasure was considered sinful by many in the Church, and sexual pleasure for women was seen as a dangerous temptation. On the other hand, there were moments in medieval society when men were expected to prove their sexual strength and fertility. In a time when heirs were the most important thing a marriage could provide, a man was often judged by his ability to impregnate his wife. But again, this wasn't about mutual consent. It was about fulfilling the duty to create heirs. If a man failed in this regard, his masculinity and the legitimacy of his marriage could come into question. But no one was talking about asking for consent or considering the desires of either party in the matter. Everything revolved around reproduction and family survival. As you think about sexual relationships in medieval times, it's clear that they were shaped by a mix of social, religious, and cultural pressures. These pressures created a world where sexual relationships were transactional and governed by duty, not desire. Women were not seen as sexual equals in their marriages. They were simply vessels for reproduction. Men, on the other hand, were expected to fulfill their roles as sexual providers. But their roles were defined not by mutual satisfaction, but by power, control, and the need to produce heirs. The issue of consent, therefore, is one that's deeply embedded in the history of marriage and sexuality. The lack of a true understanding of consent, or of mutual sexual rights, made medieval sexual relationships incredibly one-sided. As a woman, if you were married, your consent was almost never considered. Your sexuality was a tool for your husband's use, not something you owned or had control over. This imbalance of power created an environment where sexual relationships were defined by societal expectations and the legal, religious, and familial frameworks that governed them. Historians still struggle with how much agency people in medieval times had in their sexual relationships. While there is some evidence that individuals found ways to navigate the system, the general picture is one of inequality, especially for women. The concept of sexual consent, as we understand it today, was virtually non-existent, and that meant that sexual relationships in medieval times were often deeply unfair and repressive. The legacy of this lack of consent would go on to shape sexual relationships for centuries. Now that we've explored the complexities of sex in the medieval period, we can start to shift our focus to something that, while still deeply influenced by the societal structures of the time, became more pronounced during this period. The changing role of women and their relationship to sexuality and marriage. While the basic expectations for women remained firmly rooted in their duties as wives and mothers, over time, there were subtle but important shifts that would eventually lead to more discussions about the rights and agency of women, especially as the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance and the early modern era. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's take a look at how medieval society viewed women's role in marriage. Women's primary function in medieval times was to produce children, and more specifically, to produce male heirs. This was seen as their most important duty in life. If a woman succeeded in bearing children and raising them to adulthood, she was fulfilling her role. If not, her status within the family could suffer, and in some cases, her marriage could be annulled. But beyond reproduction, women were expected to be the caretakers of the household, responsible for managing the home and raising children. Within this framework, sexual relationships were, of course, not for pleasure, but for procreation. For medieval women, the idea that sex was a marital duty was reinforced through religious teachings, social expectations, and the very structure of marriage itself. The notion that a woman could have a fulfilling or enjoyable sexual life was almost non-existent in the medieval world. A woman's desires were seen as secondary to her husband's, and her body was expected to serve as a vessel for his desires and to bear children. However, we begin to see slight changes when we move into the late medieval period. The idea of courtly love, popularized by literature and troubadour songs, introduced a more idealized view of love and attraction. This romanticized love wasn't exactly about mutual affection. It was about longing, adoration, and sometimes illicit relationships. The concept of courtly love, though often associated with unattainable romantic ideals, began to challenge the rigid and utilitarian view of marriage that prevailed in earlier centuries. Courtly love was not a direct challenge to medieval marital structures. It did spark the notion that personal affection and emotional connections could play a role in relationships, even if those notions were still relegated to the realm of fantasy. Interestingly, the Church's teachings on sexuality remained firm. Sex was for procreation, and any deviation from that was considered sinful. But within this framework, we also see the first glimmers of the idea that sexual relationships might be more complicated than merely fulfilling reproductive duty. The Church's rigid stance on sexuality, including its insistence on the sinfulness of sexual pleasure, began to be questioned by some of the more progressive thinkers of the time. These thinkers pushed back against the idea that women were merely passive vessels for reproduction and that sex was only a necessary evil. But let's not get too carried away here. For most women in medieval society, the idea of autonomy over their own bodies was a distant dream. Marriage was still largely an arrangement made for political, economic, and social reasons. The average woman had little say in whom she would marry, and any romantic or sexual desires she might have were considered secondary to the family's needs. In a world where survival was a constant challenge, the idea of fulfilling personal desires took a back seat to the pressing need to produce heirs and maintain family lines. As for the men, well, men were expected to dominate in every way, including sexually. The ideal medieval man was virile, dominant, and, above all, capable of asserting his control over his wife's body. Men's sexual lives, though still shaped by the need to produce heirs, were also framed by notions of masculinity that valued sexual conquest. Infidelity might have been viewed as a sin, but in practice, it was often tolerated or even ignored, if it didn't result in illegitimate children. However, by the late medieval period, we start to see early stirrings of what would eventually become the idea of sexual rights and personal autonomy. As medieval society began to give way to the Renaissance and the early modern period, ideas about the self, the body, and personal freedom began to shift. The Protestant Reformation, for instance, questioned the authority of the Catholic Church, and with it, many of the Church's teachings on sex and marriage. As individualism took root, more people began to question the societal norms that had governed sexuality for centuries. But let's be real, for most women, even those at the highest levels of society, autonomy over their sexual lives was still far off. The medieval period, for all its complexities and contradictions, was still firmly rooted in patriarchal ideals. Even as the seeds of change were planted, it would take centuries before sexual freedom and women's rights would begin to emerge as central concerns in Western society. Historians still debate when and how the role of women in sexual relationships began to change. Some suggest that these changes were sparked by the Reformation, while others point to the slow but steady cultural shifts in the Renaissance. Still, others argue that medieval women always found ways to assert their sexual autonomy, even if it was through quiet resistance. But what is clear is that by the time we reach the modern era, the landscape of sexuality had begun to shift, albeit very slowly, and with that shift, the role of women in marriage and sex began to change as well. For now, we are still left with the medieval legacy, a time when women's bodies were not their own, when sex was about duty and survival rather than pleasure, and when the complex dance of power, reproduction, and desire shaped sexual relationships in ways we are still untangling today. The struggles for sexual autonomy, equality, and mutual respect have deep roots, and they trace all the way back to this tumultuous period in history. As we move further through the medieval period, it's impossible to ignore the impact of religious and superstitious beliefs on sexuality. The medieval worldview was shaped by religion and a deep-seated belief in the supernatural. This not only affected how people viewed sex, but also how they approached fertility, health, and the very nature of sexual desire. The Church, with its immense power, had a stranglehold on people's understanding of sex, often framing it as something to be feared, controlled, and kept under constant vigilance. One of the most prominent and enduring beliefs during this time was that sex was inherently sinful. The Church dictated that sex was only permissible within the confines of marriage, and even then, only for the purpose of procreation. Any form of sexual pleasure, especially for women, was considered immoral and sinful. This view was reinforced by the widespread belief in original sin, which, in many medieval interpretations, was tied to sexuality itself. Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden was often depicted as the origin of all sexual temptation, making women especially dangerous in the eyes of the Church because of these religious teachings. People believed that sex could lead to spiritual damnation if not approached with caution and restraint. For example, many medieval Christians believed that certain sexual positions or practices were sinful and that engaging in them would lead to spiritual punishment. Even simple pleasure in the act of sex was viewed with suspicion. Thus, for most people, sexual desire wasn't something to be embraced. It was something to be controlled, suppressed, and feared. The concept of guilt tied to sex was ever present, and many individuals carried the weight of this belief throughout their marriages. But it wasn't just the act of sex itself that was regulated. It was also how people viewed their own bodies. The body was often seen as a temple, but one that was inherently flawed due to sin. Many medieval Christians believed that the body needed to be subjugated in order to protect the soul. This led to practices such as celibacy, asceticism, and self-mortification, where individuals sought to deny their body's pleasure in an attempt to purify their souls. This fear of indulgence in the pleasures of the flesh, especially sexual ones, led to a deeply ingrained sense of guilt and self-repression. In many individuals, in some ways, sex was tied directly to health, beliefs, and superstitions. For example, people believed that sexual activity could affect one's physical well-being in bizarre ways. Medieval people often feared that excessive sexual activity could drain the body of its vital energies. Some thought that men who had too much sex would weaken themselves or even become sickly, while women were seen as needing to guard their chastity to maintain their health. These superstitions were often tied to ideas of balance in the body known as the humors, and maintaining sexual activity in moderation was seen as necessary to keep that balance. And then there were the fertility rituals and superstitions surrounding sex, especially in relation to pregnancy. With high infant mortality rates and the constant pressure on women to produce heirs, many people resorted to bizarre and often nonsensical practices to ensure fertility. The medieval world was full of magical beliefs surrounding childbirth and conception. People would often use charms, potions, and incantations to try to ensure that they would conceive a child or that the child would be born healthy. Some women even carried around amulets or wore specific garments during intercourse in hopes of influencing the outcome. For example, some medieval women believed that carrying a piece of clothing worn by a virgin would increase their chances of getting pregnant. Others might place specific herbs under their pillows or bed to ward off evil spirits and ensure a healthy pregnancy. The belief in magical protection was pervasive, especially during times of difficulty or uncertainty, such as during childbearing. These superstitions, though irrational by modern standards, were deeply ingrained in the medieval mindset and shaped how people viewed sex, fertility, and the reproductive process. Historians still debate just how widespread these superstitions were, and how much they influenced people's behavior. Some suggest that these beliefs were a direct response to the overwhelming pressures of medieval life, including high infant mortality, disease, and the general uncertainty of life. Others argue that these superstitions were an attempt to maintain some semblance of control over a world that was largely unpredictable. Whatever the case may be, it's clear that superstition and religion played a powerful role in shaping how people approached sex and sexuality during this time. The Church also promoted ideas of chastity and virginity as idealized virtues, especially for women. Virginity became a symbol of purity, and those who were able to remain chaste were often revered. In fact, the most revered female saints were often those who had taken vows of chastity. This concept of virginity was deeply tied to social status and religious devotion. But it wasn't just about abstaining from sex. It was about proving one's moral worth and religious devotion. However, there was a contradiction built into these ideals. While virginity was prized and sexual purity was upheld as the highest moral standard, many people still sought to break the rules. The concept of courtly love, which we discussed earlier, highlighted this contradiction by romanticizing unrequited love and illicit relationships. Knights and ladies would engage in forbidden love, often while remaining married to others. These relationships weren't about physical fulfillment. They were about longing, passion, and the expression of desire outside the constraints of marital duty. But here's the twist. Even though courtly love celebrated emotional and physical longing, the actual act of sexual desire was still repressed. The idea was that sexual activity outside marriage was wrong, but longing for someone else without actually engaging in sex was permissible. This created a paradox that ran through medieval culture, where the emotional and physical sides of love were often treated as separate, and the desire for sexual fulfillment was kept tightly controlled. Historians still debate whether these cultural contradictions in the medieval period were simply a product of their time, or if they were a reflection of a deeper human conflict between desire and societal expectations. Some suggest that the prevalence of such ideals and contradictions was part of the social fabric, meant to reinforce power structures and maintain control over both individuals and the population as a whole. Others believe that the tension between the desire for love and the repression of sexual pleasure paved the way for later movements toward sexual freedom and self-expression. As you look back on the medieval period, it's impossible to ignore how much religion and superstition shaped the sexual experiences of people during this time. The conflicting messages about sexuality, where pleasure was sinful, but longing and romantic idealization were acceptable, created a deeply repressive atmosphere. And while the medieval period was marked by these struggles, it was also the beginning of a journey toward greater sexual autonomy and understanding, one that would take centuries to fully unfold. As we conclude our exploration of medieval sexuality, we're left with a stark picture of a world where desire, pleasure, and intimacy were continually shaped by external forces. Religion, superstition, social structures, and strict gender roles govern nearly every aspect of sexual life. People's relationships were more about fulfilling their duties than about mutual enjoyment. And the concept of sexual autonomy, especially for women, was practically non-existent. However, we must acknowledge that despite the rigid frameworks and harsh rules, human nature found ways to express itself. While marriage was seen as a contract for survival and family legacy, people still managed to navigate their own desires, creating secret spaces for rebellion, longing, and occasionally passion. The human capacity for love, desire, and connection didn't simply vanish under centuries of repression. In fact, some of the most famous stories and poems from the medieval period, such as the tales of courtly love, show us that people were not just dutiful spouses. They were also human beings with deep emotional and physical needs at the same time. The medieval period was marked by deep contradictions. The Church's teachings on sex as a duty rather than a pleasure were pervasive, but they existed alongside widespread superstition and mystical beliefs about sexuality and fertility. Whether through magical rituals to ensure conception or the secretive, hidden relationships of courtly love, people found ways to engage with their sexuality outside the bounds of the Church's teachings. And even though medieval sex was primarily seen through a lens of reproduction, it didn't entirely shut down any possibility of affection or tenderness. It's important to remember that not all medieval marriages were devoid of love or emotional connection. Some people, especially those in higher social classes, could develop genuine affection for their spouses, even if that affection was largely overshadowed by social and familial expectations. But for the majority of people, marriage was still a pragmatic institution designed to secure survival, wealth, and family status. This was particularly true for women, whose value in marriage was often tied to their ability to bear children. For women, sex was often seen as something to endure an obligation, not a pleasure. This unequal power dynamic was reinforced by both religious teachings and social norms, and it created a deeply repressive environment for women. They were expected to be chaste before marriage, and then to submit to their husbands afterward, with little to no room for personal sexual agency. It's also crucial to understand the long-term effects of these medieval sexual norms. The oppressive nature of sexual relationships, particularly for women, didn't simply disappear after the medieval period ended. The transition from the medieval to the Renaissance, and later to the Enlightenment, didn't immediately change the dynamics of sex and gender roles. Many of the restrictions placed on women's sexual autonomy continued well into the modern era. But the medieval period laid the foundation for a gradual evolution in attitudes toward sex, relationships, and individual rights. Historians still argue about when and how these changes began to take place. Some suggest that the medieval period was a time of stifled sexuality that needed to be liberated in later centuries. Others argue that medieval society was simply different from our own, and that we shouldn't judge it too harshly by modern standards. There's also the question of how much medieval people actually wanted or felt the need for the freedoms we associate with modern sexual liberation. Were they simply adhering to a set of rules, or did they truly feel oppressed? It's hard to say for sure, but what's clear is that the medieval period left a deep imprint on the way we think about sex, gender, and relationships today. As we wrap up this journey through medieval sexuality, it's important to recognize that despite the often harsh and repressive structures that defined people's sexual lives, there was a remarkable resilience and adaptability to human desires. Whether through the passionate, idealized stories of courtly love or the magical rituals to ensure fertility, people still sought out ways to connect and express themselves. Even in a world that often made such expressions feel dangerous or forbidden, medieval sexuality, with all its contradictions, ultimately serves as a reminder of how much our understanding of sex and relationships has evolved. We live in a world today where, for the most part, our sexual lives are governed by personal choice and mutual consent, rather than societal duty or religious dictates. But that freedom didn't come without a long, difficult struggle. The journey from medieval repression to modern sexual freedom took centuries, and it was shaped by the movements, revolutions, and shifts in cultural and social thought that followed the medieval period. And as we look forward, it's essential to remember that the fight for sexual autonomy and equality is ongoing. We may have made progress since the medieval period, but there are still many parts of the world where sexual rights and personal freedoms are limited or repressed. So, the next time you think about how far we've come, remember that the medieval period was just the beginning of a long journey, a journey that continues to unfold even today. **Now. As you lie back and reflect on this journey through the medieval world. Let yourself unwind from the weight of centuries-old expectations and repression. The past may be distant, but it's still with us, influencing our present in ways we often don't realize. So, take a deep breath, feel the weight of time. Ease off your shoulders and rest easy, knowing that history has always been a part of shaping who we are today.